so thank you very much for inviting me. I'm always happy to talk about the FAIR data principles, and I've entitled this The What and Why of the FAIR data principles, because we will go into them in a little bit of detail so that you gain a deeper understanding. But I think, as Tracy indicated in her message to me, we also want to understand why the FAIR data principles were articulated. So just as a disclaimer, I'm associated with a company called SciCrunch Incorporated, and it developed tools and services supporting reproducibility and particular research resource identifiers, which I will mention later in the talk. So that satisfies my conflict of interest board. So the topics that we're going to cover today, since this was on research improvement, is we're going to talk a little bit about data management and sharing and what they are and why they're important. What are the FAIR data principles? Why were they introduced? And then take a deeper dive into some of the FAIR data principles that are somewhat arcane in some places, but I hope to elucidate them to you. And then also try to bring it back to how FAIR impacts you when you manage your data in the laboratory and when you are confronted with having to share it with others, whether that be anonymous third parties through data sharing mandates, or just sharing in your lab in general with your PI or yourself, your future self. So the overall learning objectives is that you will understand the FAIR data principles at a deeper level, and then also understand how to incorporate FAIR practices for data management and sharing into your laboratory and practice. So in the United States was a little slow to come to funder mandates for open data, but I know around the world, funders in general are saying it's time for researchers not just to write papers, but also to share the primary data that goes into these papers on a regular basis. And so basically the tenor around data sharing is that you should just assume in the United States that your data will be shared. We understand that there's sensitive data, human subject data, that not all data can be shared openly, but you should assume that you are going to have to publish your data just like you publish a paper. And so you need to start thinking about how you're going to manage your data in order to achieve this. And it's interesting that NIH explicitly says, the US National Institutes of Health, which is our major funding agency, says that all data must be managed. So they understand that how you handle your data in the lab is going to be integral to how easy it's going to be able to share this with others and how effectively you're going to be able to do it. And the other thing they said is that data should be fair. And if you look at a lot of the open science mandates, journal policies, they all say data should be fair, okay? So we're going to take a look at the FAIR principles in just a moment, but in order to bring this back to the personal, I just want to reiterate again, this will be one of the themes of my talk, that good data management is the gateway to sharing. And by data management, it says, how do I handle data in the laboratory? Okay. Normally, in studies of research data management practices of researchers, and this is one of them by John Borghi and Daniela Lowenberg, that when it comes to sharing data, each of us has a way of doing things, but there's no standard, there's no plan, there's nothing. Basically, if you come into a lab, you're responsible for managing your own data. It's on your own hard drives, it's on cloud servers, it's on whatever it is. And you do it so that it makes sense to you. The idea of good data management for sharing is that you basically put plans in place in your laboratory so that your data are optimized for reuse. So we go from, when it comes to my data, I have a way of doing things, but no standard or documented plans, to I have created plans for managing my data that are designed to streamline its future use by myself and others. So it is deliberate and it is planned. So the question is, how do we do that? How do we optimize reuse for ourselves and others? And that's really where the FAIR data principles come in. That is why they were articulated. And FAIR is a brilliant acronym. It was instituted by a group of people at a Leiden workshop, and Baron Mons was the genius behind the acronym itself. It basically says that all data must be findable, it must be accessible, it must be interoperable, and it must be reusable. And the other critical piece about FAIR is that it is for both humans and machines, okay? That is, a computer can access your data and understand your data, but humans also can access and understand data. So it is really this dual piece, that it is directed for both humans and machines, that is the critical piece of FAIR. So why was FAIR implemented? Why was it necessary to create this great acronym to get people to think about their data differently? Well, I came at this from the neurosciences. I'm a professor of neurosciences and been a neuroscientist since 1980 something, so for many, many, many years. And I lived through the great wave, the great transition from before there was an internet to when there was an internet. And back in the 1990s, neuroscience got together and said, you know what, the internet is here. This is going to be a very powerful way for us to share our data. We're going to be able to create all these computational resources. We're going to be able to do exactly what the genomics community did by putting their data open. And this is going to be great. It's going to herald a new age of discovery. And people started to create online resources. They started to create databases. They started to create computational platforms. They put data sets online if they were in a laboratory. And the problem is that nobody knew, even NIH itself, who funded a lot of these things, what exactly had been created, and nobody could actually query it. So find it. You have all these databases. Databases are very hard for a search engine like Google to query, because they're part of something that's called the hidden web. We don't need to get into that, but it still remains the case today that it is very difficult for search engines to get inside of databases. So NIF, the Neuroscience Information Framework, was given this task of first cataloging everything that had been done. And we found thousands and thousands of these databases. We found thousands of things that people were already putting on the web. And our job was to try to figure out how to search inside of them. We had to search inside of databases. We had to figure out what data sets meant. And our job was also to articulate best practices for creating neuroscience data resources so that it became easier to do these things. So the project ran, the portal is still up, but roughly it ran from about 2006 to 2018, 18 or 19. So it went for quite a while. And what did NIF find? And what was the state of neuroscience data at that time? In fact, it was not very good. It was a very difficult task to do. And why was that? Well, there were a lot of broken links. So a lot of data sets were posted, a lot of data sets were put inside of papers and they were linked to. A lot of databases were created that had records that we were able to link to, and the links would break. In fact, after about 5 years, only about 20% of links to data sets and tools are still available. So that was a big problem. There was very little metadata that was associated with these data sets. So if you found them, it was often very hard to understand what they meant. And we'll get into a definition of metadata in just a bit. But these were not the only problems. We found cryptic variables. So you would see that there's a brain region, and the brain region was number 1, and one didn't know what number 1 was. There were all these proprietary data formats that no longer could be read. There were missing key variables. The semantics, the labels that were annotated, these data were annotated with, we found 15 different labels for one brain region alone. It was just a mess. And that meant that if there were different labels used across data resources, you didn't know if those could be put together. There were no clear licenses at the time because we didn't think about it. We just shoved stuff up on the web, but nobody knew, were you allowed to use this? Were you not allowed to use this? Because it didn't say. Very few data standards for neuroscience data. No provenance. Nobody knew where the data necessarily came from or who to talk to if they had a question. There were a few experimental protocols that explained how the data were created, and there were very few notes on how you could effectively reuse this data. So this was pretty much the state of neuroscience data circa about 2015, not all that long ago. And finally, we found many, many examples where the data were not machine readable or computable. And what we mean by that is a computer would not be able to take that formatted data and use it in an operation. So let's look at some of these definitions and really getting down to this issue of machine readability. So just some definitions in case you are lost. Metadata is something we'll talk about a lot, and in its elemental form, it means data about data. Things like file format, file size, those things are in file headers, and your computer generally can read those pretty well. But mostly what we're going to be talking about here is descriptive metadata. That is describing a data set for purposes such as discovery, identification, provenance, usage notes, all of those types of things that are associated with the data set. So that's what's called descriptive metadata. Machine readability means that data is in a format that can be easily processed by a computer without human intervention while ensuring that no semantic meaning is lost. Okay, what that means is that it is in a format, for example, CSV, RDF, XML, JSON, which many of you may be familiar with, or it is marked up by a micro format like HTML so that a computer can read it and operate on this information. Just for those who may not be familiar with CSV files, because we're going to see an example in just a moment, that stands for comma separated value. And it's basically just a text file that uses a comma to separate values. And each line of that file is a data record. Why is CSV important? Well, that is a format that can be easily read by spreadsheets. So Excel, Google Sheets, numbers, basically all of those things can read CSV files. So let's get back to this issue of machine readability and the types of things that we saw in NIF. Here is an example that I gave. This looks like a CSV file, right? Underneath it, it's been interpreted by a spreadsheet. Or is it really? So what's interesting about what we saw and the way that people shared data is that many people shared pictures of their spreadsheets. So this top one here is a picture. You'll notice I can't select it. I can't do anything with it. A machine would have to be able to crack using optical character recognition and get the comments right, get the tables right. And to this day, cracking tables is still very difficult for computers to do. On the bottom, which is the same content, you can see that this is part of a spreadsheet. I can select it. Age is not now a picture of a number, but it's an actual number. So if I wanted to calculate the mean age of my animals, I would be able to do so because a computer can perform that basic operation, okay? So we were seeing, and this actually, we had somebody only about 2 years ago, we asked them for their data and they gave us a picture of their data. This is what we mean by making things findable, accessible, interoperable, and usable to both humans and machines. A human understands this top one perfectly well, but a computer has a lot of difficulty with it. Whereas down below, if we shared the spreadsheet itself or a CSV file, the raw data underneath it, there would be no trouble for that computer to be able to recreate exactly what we see here and do operations on it. And for those of you who are interested a little bit more about formatting and the basics of data operations, there is a website called School of Data, which goes through everything from the very beginning, and I highly recommend it. Okay. So that's basically why FAIR was put into place. All of us, and it wasn't just NIF, but it was groups around the world who were trying to work with online data, were all having a heck of a time. And I went back to my slides a long time ago, some of the slide presentations that I gave in the early 2000s when we just started NIF. And I said, you know, if you really want to use data, first you got to be able to find it, and you've got to be able to open it and use it, and then you've got to be able to understand it. So you could sort of see the echoes of the FAIR data principles in there. We were not the only ones, though. Everybody was dealing with the same thing. So let's take a closer look at what the FAIR principles actually say. A lot of people know the upper level acronym, but what they don't know is that there's actually 15 different principles that are in there, or recommendations, I should say, that FAIR makes about how you go about making things findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of them because they're very detailed and some are very technical, but I do want to go through some so that people start to understand the types of things that FAIR is talking about. Ultimately, Again, always remember that this was designed for the web, the internet. If we didn't have that, things might be a little bit different. So let's look at the findability one and look at the first two recommendations for findability. And just ignore the metadata and data. What that says is it really doesn't matter if you're dealing with data or metadata, the same principles hold. So F1 is that data are assigned a globally unique and persistent identifier. And F2 are data are described with rich metadata. Now, listening to my introduction, you might say, well, I understand why you want to describe things with rich metadata, but I think a lot of people are often surprised by the first one. Why is the very first thing in FAIR talking about these globally unique identifiers? And if you go to a site that's maintained in the EU called GoFair, it says, Principle F1 is arguably the most important because it will be hard to achieve other aspects of FAIR without globally unique and persistent identifiers. Hence, compliance with F1 will already take you a long way towards publishing FAIR data. So what is a globally unique and persistent identifier? Unique basically means that it is unique in the world. It identifies one thing and one thing only, okay? So just like when you type a URL into your web browser, it can't take you to 10 potential sites. It takes you to only one site. So globally unique basically means that it is unique in the world. And stable means that it persists. So persist means that it is never reused, okay? So once it's been issued, it stays stable. It never is reused. If for some reason the thing that it identifies gets retired, the identifier itself still stays and it still tells you what it used to identify. So think about books that are out of print. Just because they're out of print, you still know that that book existed. So that's what stable means. And it's important to remember that there's nothing magical about the identifiers I'm going to talk about. The only reason that they are persistent and unique is because there are organizations that stand behind them to make sure that they are persistent and unique, much like URLs. There's organizations that sit behind it that says these things have to be unique. They are resolvable in many cases. That means you can plug it into a web browser and be taken to whatever object it identifies. And it really allows a digital object to be reliably tied to its metadata. So these persistent identifiers are so important in the FAIR world that they actually had a conference for many years called Pitapalooza that was just dedicated to unique identifiers, okay? So what are some examples of unique identifiers that you might have encountered? Well, you've seen these DOIs. These DOIs identify papers. They were actually implemented by publishers after the web came into existence because they realized that all their URLs were breaking. What happens when you redo your system or you redo your link structures? Those URLs break. If you don't keep payment up on your domain name, it can resort to something else. This instability, of course, was the kiss of death for scholarship, which required that we could reliably find the things that were being referenced. So DOIs were introduced by the publishers specifically to avoid this link rot that was happening all over the place. But that's not the only type of identifier. There's your ORCIDs, there's research resource identifiers, there's PubMed Central IDs, there's basically things that are all over the place. And we'll see uses of this in just a moment in other contexts, such as ontologies. So these identifiers are very, very important. And the preferred DOIs for dataset, the preferred PIDs for datasets are DOIs. A lot of the data repositories where you publish your data will issue a DOI. And I mentioned that there's a resolution service. So if you take this DOI and you plug it into the doi.org resolution service, it will actually take you to that particular data set, okay? So PIDs are very, very powerful. But they're less powerful if they're not tied to rich metadata. So one of the things you will notice about the FAIR data principles is that they're not very prescriptive. It says you must have rich metadata, but it doesn't tell you what rich metadata are. And this was done on purpose because FAIR is meant to apply broadly across all different contexts. And what is rich metadata in one community may not be rich metadata in another community. So it really leaves it up to individual research communities like biomedicine, physiology, whatever it is, to be able to interpret it in a way that makes sense for their domains, okay? But the idea is that when you plug your ID into a resolution service, you should be taken to something that describes and tells you what it is that you are looking at. So, for example, if you plug in a DOI of an article, it takes you to the abstract page. The abstract page tells you, well, here's the title, here's the journal that it's been published in, here are the authors of this, here are the keywords, here's a description of what it is that this is all about. Here are your access permissions, here are the licenses. So it provides you with all of the context that you need, both as a human and as a machine, to understand what it is that you are looking at. And what we have found is that when it comes to data, researchers tend to be very stingy in the metadata that they provide. So what you're seeing here is a data set that was put in to a repository of neurophysiology. And the title given to the data set was 202-00611 AIBS mouse. And the description, Allen Institute, June 2020, mouse patch-seq IC ePhys data. Now, you know that the Allen Institute, which is a big brain institute in the US, would never publish a paper that was given this title or this description, but it is routinely done with data. So if you see this and you come to it, you don't get any human understanding at all. It doesn't tell you anything about your how to access the data or things that you may need to know about it. In fact, it's extremely sparse. So even though rich metadata is not defined explicitly, you can see that this is not rich metadata. It doesn't give you very much help. And it also won't help in the findability part in that there's very little to search here. You might get it if you look for patch-seq for mouse, but other than that, there's very little in here for a search engine to digest. So here's an example of a project called Spark that does have rich metadata. If you go to a Spark data set, you get a title, you get authors, you get the license, you get links to protocols, you get descriptions and abstracts, you have availability of code, you get keywords, you provide the grant. This is a much more rich representation than you saw in that Spartan example from the BRAIN project. So rich metadata aids in search, provides provenance and credit for those who produce it, and valuable context for understanding the data. Okay. Oops, I see we're almost halfway through. So, so basically, a take-home lesson from this talk is that regardless of whether somebody says something is rich or not rich, in general, more metadata is always better than less metadata or fewer metadata. I couldn't decide what grammatically was correct. I think it's fewer metadata. But the more metadata you provide, the better off everybody is. Okay. Accessibility, we won't go through this very heavily because it's really highly technical. But basically, you know, you need to be able to allow for authentication and authorization. FAIR is not equivalent to open, right? We understand that there may be authorization that's necessary, but it ought to be, right, easy for you to use. We already mentioned that metadata should continue to exist even if the underlying data are no longer available, just like those books out of print. You want to be able to retrieve metadata by using a standard communications protocol. So you may have been involved in submitting an abstract or some other document where it says, gee, if you give me the DOI, if you give the computer the DOI in the form, it can go and retrieve all the metadata about who authored that article. And that's really what that means. And ideally, again, it's built on open, free, and universally implementable services and nothing that's proprietary. So findable and accessible really deal at the highest level of being able to just first locate a data set, and then if you've located it, all the things that are necessary for you to be able to access it. The interoperable and reusability pieces really delve much more deeply into the nature of the data itself. And we're not going to have time to go through everything, but one thing I wanted to focus on in the interoperability was the importance of using vocabularies that themselves follow the FAIR data principles. So what does that mean and why is that important? for interoperability, okay? So fair vocabularies basically mean that they are, like everything in FAIR, designed for both computers to digest and humans to understand and apply. So they have the same characteristics as FAIR data. All of the concepts in the vocabularies have persistent identifiers. They have rich metadata. They also have relationships to other things. They tend to mitigate against the lexical variants that so characterize our languages. So as you mentioned in NIF, we had 16 different names for the anterior cingulate cortex. What these FAIR vocabularies do is they say, you as a human can call this whatever you want, but as long as it resolves to the same identifier, the machine itself doesn't care. It knows that those two things are equivalent, okay? So here you see an example of a FAIR vocabulary. This is from an ontology that's called Uberon, which is an anatomical ontology. And it's got the name, which is the cortex of the kidney, but right underneath you see that it's got this identifier. You see that it has a lot of synonyms that are associated with it. You can put as many synonyms as you want. It doesn't matter. They all resolve to the same ID. So FAIR vocabularies come in many different forms. Those research resource identifiers that I've mentioned a couple times, which identify organisms, reagents, and tools, ontologies, and controlled vocabularies. You may be familiar with the gene ontology. All of those are Uberon. Those are all excellent sources of FAIR vocabularies. There's plenty of places to go to in order to be able to look them up. But why is that so important for interoperability? Well, I want to give you an example here. These are made up data sets, but I call it a tale of three data sets. There's three data sets, data set 1, data set 2, and data set 3. They all report on age. They report on the organism they used. They have a gene, and they have an anatomical location. And if you look across, you see that, well, these are different age groups, and this one says adult, okay. They've got 3 different animals. One is just a cryptic 6. We don't know what that means. Looks like 3 different genes. And maybe these are all the same things. We don't actually know because the word cortex is used in many other cases in biological systems. So we really don't know. So if one wanted to combine these data together or to cross-link them, what would be difficult for the computer to do? Well, we're not going to have time to go into the age here, but you can see that there's a problem in combining age because we don't know what adult means. And you've got 2 different age ranges here that are partially overlapping. But of course, the best practice is that you always give individual subject data. That way you don't have to worry about whether these things are collapsible. But I want to focus now on just these problems down here. So if we look at these, ostensibly, the computer doesn't know if these things are the same or different. They look different, and it would treat them as different. But if we go and we annotate our data with FAIR vocabularies, in fact, we can see that all 3 of these things here are the same mouse strain. Doesn't matter what we call them. There's multiple shorthands. This is the official strain nomenclature, which if you work in this area, you know is somewhat of a nightmare. But if you look at it, you can see that this is in fact the same animal. You can see that this is the same gene. They all have the same ID. And you can see here that the cortex of the kidney and the renal cortex are in fact the same thing, but this one here refers to the cerebral cortex in the brain. So it is in fact different. So if I wanted to combine these data sets or compare these data sets, you can see that I can compare it across several dimensions, but not all of them, okay? But why is it important to be able to combine these? Well, the fact that I know that we're looking at the same gene and the same strain means that I've extended the information that I know about this particular data set. I know that it's not just in the renal cortex. This gene is also in the cerebral cortex. It's not just in young animals, but it's also in the adults. So that is why these FAIR vocabularies are so powerful. They provide some semantics that are interpretable by a computer so that you can combine them. And finally, let's get into reusability. So reusability, of course, is the sine qua non of FAIR. The whole purpose of all this is not just to find it, access it, and look at it, but to be able to reuse the data. So all of the above 3 are necessary pre-steps, but reusability again brings up this richness. You want to describe your data with a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes that is beyond that basic descriptive metadata that you had into the deeper aspects of your experiment. The more information you give, the more easy it is for people to use your data, including you. You want to take care of that license. So you want to release it with a clear and accessible data usage license. You want to provide the provenance. How did your data get there? That can be simple things like who produced it, what institution were you at, right? And what experimental protocol did you use? But if you've transformed that data, if you've put it through processes, you would want to know that, right? You would want to know how that data came into existence. And you want to meet domain relevant community standards. So there's that word community again, because the standards are different across all different communities. So we don't have time to go into what types of standards might be there, but there are websites there that have actually gone and cataloged all of the terminology artifacts, the vocabularies, the formats, reporting guidelines, identifier schemas that are in use across science, and made it available for you to be able to look up and assess. So just to summarize, we have FAIR in what I call in a nutshell. You basically are producing data, and down at the center of this is always those raw bits and bytes that are computable and accessible and usable by machines. You have a set of identifiers that identify the high-level data set itself as an entity and a lot of the things that are in the data set, the metadata that's associated with it. You have standards and code that aid in reuse. When you use a standard, it means that you not only can use the software that you yourself may have written, but you can use any software that has been written against that standard. So very, very important. And it has enough contextual documentation and metadata so that you can understand both what you are seeing and any caveats about using the data, any conditions to use that data, because it is all in your metadata. So this really is what a FAIR data object is. It's not just the bits and bytes, but it's all the layers that sit around it that make it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So I think I will stop there, except let me just go past a few slides because I do want to end with this. We think about FAIR in terms of data sharing. It was really designed for data that was being put out on the web, but FAIR actually applies to the entire data life cycle. It is much harder to share at the end if you haven't thought about sharing at the beginning. And a lot of researchers would say, well, why on earth do I have to devote all this extra time just so I can share data with third parties whom I don't know? And the interesting thing is that if you think about FAIR throughout the data lifecycle, the primary beneficiary of that is going to be you, your future self, it's going to be your PI, it's going to be your lab mates, and any colleagues that you have, because it is going to make it much easier for you to share with each other, just like you saw in that chart, rather than at the end of the experiment when it's time, because the journal tells you I have to put this in this repository in order to get my paper published. And you're like, I don't know where my data is. I don't know which version I was working on. I don't know how this data got there. If you are very deliberate about this, and your lab is very deliberate about it through the entire life cycle, the quality of data that you produce, the time and effort that you produce, that you require in order to make use of this data, will be dramatically decreased. So that is why I say that data management is the gateway to data sharing, but this data sharing is not just with anonymous third parties, it's also with yourself. So these are just some of the questions that you can ask yourself, but overall, what you're really trying to go towards is what will I or my PI or my peers need to know in a year, let's say. I had to abandon my project, I'd come back in a year. It's been a long publication process. They want extra information. I don't remember where I put everything. What will you need to find, access, and understand the data that you have produced? Okay, so let me end there. and then open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I really like the last slide emphasizing, what researchers can do and what this means for them. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the how before I open things up to the audience for questions, because I think that was an excellent overview of the what and the why. But for this series, we also want to think about the how. And so I think when we're starting a science improvement initiative, we have two components that are really important. There's the people, and there's the solution. And so can you tell us a little bit about, you said, we have all of these groups that are having different problem or the same problem with the data sets that are produced, and there are lots of problems. So how did you get a collection of people together to solve the problem? And how did you decide that a set of guiding principles was the solution?
So that's an interesting question. Around the early part of the teens, I guess we would call it, around 2011 or 2010, 2011. I looked on the message board at my institution, which is UCSD, but I'm in a building called Cal IT. And there was an advertisement for a conference called Beyond the PDF. And it basically said, you know what, we are still publishing everything in a form that existed for 350 years. And all we've done to adapt things to the web is to create digital paper in the form of a PDF. And so it turned out there were quite a few people in my building who were all struggling with the same thing. And they had a workshop in Leiden in 2012, after this workshop called Beyond the PDF, where they said, you know what, we really need to be thinking about the future of research communications, and it needs to be transformed through technology. And they formed an organization called Force 11. Now, at this meeting, Beyond the PDF, it was the most electric conference I have ever been to. It was like pent-up frustration of everybody who sort of saw the promise of where we were going, but was just continually frustrated by how difficult it was to sort of boil the ocean, right? To sort of take the entire academic publishing enterprise and retool it around data, retool it around machine readable formats, retool it around the web, essentially. So we spent a couple of years inside of Force 11 sort of thinking through different aspects of how do we change the system. We talked about incentive systems. How do we get people to publish their data? How do we get them to publish better data? And we learned a long time, fairly quickly, that because Force 11 was sort of independent of any domain, that if you tried to be prescriptive, first of all, the technology was changing so quickly that if you said, well, everything needs to be encoded in RDF, and there were a bunch of people who said that everything needs to be coded in RDF, you knew that in 3 years, RDF may be an obsolete format, right? So we knew that the technology flux was so large that trying to tell people exactly what to do and how to code things was likely going to be a dead end. But you also realized that with all these different communities, there were no universals. You had to really articulate principles to say, we don't care what domain you are in. We don't care what your context is. These are the things you have to aspire to. So we first did the principles in something called the data citation principles, where we said, we really want to be able to cite data like we cite papers. And we ended up just coming up with high-level principles that basically say, you go do this in whatever way makes sense for your domain, but you need to adhere to a couple of these things, right? These are the things you need to keep in mind. So Force 11, unlike RD Research Data Alliance, which also launched around the same time, which was really developing technical protocols and specifications, really focused on principles. Because it says, if, for example, we can articulate principles, it means that we understand the problem well enough, right, to formulate guidelines for action, a framework for action. So that's why we focused on principles. And I think that that's why they've been enduring. If they had said, oh, you must encode this in the semantic web and it must be open link data, it never would have worked.
Mm-hmm. And how about getting your people together? So you've mentioned that there was a conference. Were you relying on that network, or were you expanding and building your network as you went?
So we were expanding and building it. There were about 40 people in the beginning who who really kind of got Force 11 going. And we got a grant from the Alfred Sloan Foundation to try to develop it a little bit further. So we spent some time, I spent some time in that organization. And what I learned there was that it was a very different style of working than I was used to in neuroscience. It was a very open science type way of working, which meant you had sort of working groups and you hacked things and you sort of did things together. Very different from most of the scientific societies that you participate in, where they tend to be the program, here's my abstract, and it's not a very sort of action oriented milieu. So some of the people, Maryann Martone and others, got together in another workshop in Leiden. And unfortunately, I wasn't at that workshop. But when they came back, I was president of Force 11 at the time, and Maryann said, hey, we came up with these principles. And I looked at them and I'm like, love them. Let's put them out on Force 11. So we did. We put them out on Force 11 as, to make them available for comment. And they were the FAIR data principles. They basically said, you need to make your data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And they immediately resonated with me because of NIF, because I'm like, oh yeah, right. Those are exactly the same things that we found. You couldn't find data, you couldn't access it, you could certainly not combine it with anything else, and you couldn't reuse it. So I think that at that time, in the early days that we were working, there was not a lot of support in the general research community for open data and making data available. That had been sort of a long push over the course of about 20 or 30 years. But just as FAIR was being articulated, there were directives, for example, coming from the US government saying that everything has to be open, right? You can't hold your data anymore. All US government funded data has to be open. Similar things in the EU, right? Similar things around the world. And FAIR just happened to hit the sweet spot when everyone's like, yes, but do we know how to do this effectively? And we're like, yes, we do, right? Yes, we do. It's not completely prescriptive. And the nice thing about FAIR is, A, you get to stamp yourself with a value judgment, like we're fair, everybody wants to be fair. But I think people saw in them, like NIH saw in them, that this is not so onerous that you can't do it. And it doesn't require that you hit all 15 in order to improve the situation. Even if all we did was have rich metadata and PIDs for every data set, we would be ahead of the game compared to where we were in the past, okay? So I think it's just a very flexible way to operate. And I think the timing just happened to be correct.
Conveniently.
Yes.
Okay, so you mentioned that you had a lot of people who were very passionate about the topic and had a lot of thoughts and ideas about the problem, about solutions in their domain. And I'm curious about how you get all of those people moving in the same direction towards solutions and agreeing. And you've mentioned that focusing on principles rather than details is part of that.
Yes.
Are there other strategies that you would recommend?
So what I think is interesting, and I've given, I wrote a perspective about this in GigaScience, and I gave a big talk at Society for Neuroscience too about this. All of those investments very early on, that identification of a group of people who were very sort of passionate about this and really wanted to work to make this a reality. A lot of the things we did early failed. The technology wasn't good enough. We were naive about how difficult the problem was. I mean, there was all of those problems. But I often, tell my students, every time I was ready to give up, all of a sudden, something shifted that basically said, no, the set of skills that you have developed are exactly the set of skills we need at this time. And so I try to encourage all of the people who sometimes feel like you're fighting in the darkness. You are now, because if the world is not ready for it for whatever reason, they're not going to adopt it. But the important thing is, when communities are finally ready to do it, you have this rich history of fails, and successes that you can build on. So we were really helped by the fact that the technology improved very rapidly. When we were first starting, there was no cloud. There was something called the grid, and it was academic software, and it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible and painful. And those projects all failed. There was a whole lot of them in the mid 2000 the O's, as we call them, right? And they failed because the technology just wasn't good enough. But now, just like you're seeing with artificial intelligence, right? The first round of artificial intelligence, all that enthusiasm in the 90s also failed because the processing power just wasn't there, the expertise wasn't there. But you kind of imagine the future, you keep working on it and working on it, such that when the technology caught up, you also had the human capital to help usher this through, right? You had something, it's like I used to say, every day somebody's getting up and going, we shouldn't really be publishing PDFs. And those thoughts are occurring around all the 7 billion people on the planet. But in fact, they've been thought upon and acted upon. So by the time somebody comes to that realization, there's a rich body of work that they can reference in order to bring this into fruition. And all of a sudden, neuroscience was hostile, absolutely hostile to data sharing in the early days. We were building all these repositories, nobody was using them. But all of a sudden, I think because the problems with reproducibility started to come in, the promise of big data started to come in, everybody realized you were not going to be able to acquire all this data on your own. You had to be able to combine, you had to be able to use it. There was just all of a sudden this big shift in the neuroscientists' attitudes, not 100%. But compared to what it was before, where people used to curse us out when we would actually even suggest that they share their data, I think we got the ammunition with the reproducibility issues and transparency issues. And then all of a sudden, the promise of big data comes into existence, where everybody realizes that's the future, right? The future of all of this is data and compute. And this is how we match data and compute. We make it fair. So I think there were just a lot of different trends. But, somebody has to, in the beginning, see the future and work towards it, get frustrated, get angry. But I think the nice thing about it, when you find a community like Force 11, I think Force 11 and then the INCF in neuroscience helped focus that community, give it a home where they could hone their arguments, hone the technologies, really work towards what was going to be necessary to implement this. And if you look at the huge investments that happened in neuroscience over the past 2 years through the large international brain projects like the HPP in the EU and the Brain Initiative in the US, how many people who, are the scarred, battled, weary warriors from before end up running those infrastructures, right? They were the ones who said, yeah, no, we know how to do this, right? We know how to do this. And it was interesting that the ones who came through Force 11 and INCF implemented FAIR much more effectively than those who hadn't. And in fact, the first meeting we had of the Brain Initiative, nobody had ever even heard of FAIR. This was in 2017. And now the last meeting I went to, everyone's talking about, oh, we've made our data fair. We've done this, we've done this, we've done this. So I think there are sets of circumstances that have to be satisfied. But if you can find a group of people that you really enjoy working with, where you can key off each other and basically use that shared intellect, it's a lot more enjoyable than sort of working by yourself in the darkness.